briefly introduce our distinguished scholar today. Professor Carlin Romano is Visiting Professor of Humanities at Ashoka University and a Fulbright Nehru Senior Scholar to India for academic and professional excellence. In the US, Romano teaches media theory and philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also a well-known journalist and public intellectual, having served for many years as both the literary editor and critique of the Philadelphia Inquirer and critique at large of the Chronicle of Higher Education. His major book, America the Philosophical, offers a 672-page overview of the US and philosophical culture. The Los Angeles Review of Books described it as a massive, impressive, and indispensable, perhaps the best history of American philosophy of the last half century. So once again, welcome to you, Professor Carlin Romano. Now I would request our head of the department, Professor Dinesh Chaudhary, for formally welcoming us.
I welcome you all who are present in this seminar hall. To all my students, my colleague Professor Anand Mishra, my colleague Professor R.K. Shah, Dr. P.K. Babu, Dr. Niti Singh, and Dr. Rahul Moria. I welcome Professor Carlin Romano, who has written the book America the Philosophical. In that book, I think he has said that America's intellectual and ancestor is Isocrates, a little younger than Socrates. So, we will see in his lecture how he comes to this conclusion. I welcome again all of you and Professor Romano.
Now I request Professor Romano, please come and deliver his talk.
First, I thank you for coming on a Saturday. I see some of my friends from yesterday, so I appreciate your making time on a Saturday. I asked them to project the cover and the back of the book so you can learn a little bit more about it. Donating this copy to the philosophy library here. So anybody wants to look at it in the future, please do. So I will take you through the book, but I want to say a few things at first, because I don't want you to think that this book is an act of jingoism in favor of the United States. I am someone who does not believe my country right or wrong. We have a lot of problems in my country right now with our present leadership. I meant this book, which took me 10 years, to be a descriptive act about how I see philosophical culture in the United States. And it is not meant to derogate, to look down on any other culture. In other words, I argue in this book that the philosophical culture of the United States is a great philosophical culture. But that doesn't mean that the culture of India is not great, or the culture of Germany, or so on. I wrote it, and one reason I use this title, American Philosophical, is that most Americans would think American philosophical, that's crazy. We're not a philosophical culture. We are militaristic, we're capitalistic, we're colonialist, whatever else. And all of those things may be true, and have been true at different times. But my feeling growing up as a young man, becoming intellectually familiar with misunderstanding. Actually, we have a very great philosophical culture, and I'll try to explain why I think that is. One of the questions that has often come up, this book was meant for a broad audience, not just for academics. Even at the last minute, my editor said, oh, and we're going to have pictures in it. And you're going to pay for the pictures. You're going to have to go get the pictures and so on. So we have pictures of William James and John Dewey and all of those people. But the idea was to write a book that would be accessible to educated people to think about this thesis of the United States. But I did not take lightly the idea that maybe I'm wrong, right? As philosophers, we should always be thinking maybe we're wrong. Maybe somebody has a better argument. Maybe someone has counter evidence. So the first part of my book is actually an introduction where I go through many of the arguments for America the unphilosophical. You know, that we don't have philosophers who play like a great role in our public life. Our philosophers are not often on the media. They often don't write for the newspapers. They don't become president like Radhakrishnan, you know. So there's a lot of, argument. You can say that we're not a philosophical, culture. But my argument for that thesis is based on a few key things. One, and I feel funny saying this because right now in the United States we're having a crisis in regard to freedom of expression. But traditionally, and I would say this as a journalist who's been in maybe as many as 100 countries in my life, we have, I believe, maybe up to the moment that Trump became president, the widest freedom of expression of any country in the world. Partly because of our First Amendment, which is supposed to protect us from the government telling people what they can't say. At the moment, Trump is trying to tell everybody what they can't say. I do believe he will not succeed in this, but it's a pretty nasty situation at the moment. But because of the First Amendment, and because of what I would say is a tradition in the U.S. of everybody feeling they can say what they think, no matter what level of society they're at, even the lowest level of society, people feel they have the right to express their opinion. So that's one reason. Another, if I may mention a word which again Trump administration doesn't like very much, diversity. We have a tremendously diverse country. Everybody in this room, I would confidently say, could find their community in the United States somewhere. Whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's ethnic, whether it's geographical, and so on. And what this means is that you just think about a great bookstore, for instance. Our great bookstores will have just about every philosophical perspective that has ever been articulated in the world, and every religious perspective. And we have professorships of every sort. I was a so-called distinguished visiting professor at a university called Florida Atlantic University. And I noticed the other day that they had recently created a chair in Jain studies, funded by some wealthy, Jain mogul in the United States. But you'll find this around the country that there are professorships that reflect the ethnic and religious and philosophical diversity of our country. California, you'll find professorships that deal with Armenian studies, for instance. So this is a second reason why I think we have such a strong philosophical culture. Now, when I went around the country, because I had what we call a book tour when this book came out, so I have been to 16 different cities, many people ask me, are you arguing that the philosophy profession is so great in America? And I said, well, no, my book is not about just the philosophy profession. One of the key arguments in my book is that you don't have to be a philosophy professor to be a philosopher, and even to be an influential philosopher. So I will take you through the book shortly, and you'll see what I mean by that. But I would say it is also true that professionally, if you just think about professional philosophy, we are a tremendously strong culture. I'll just give you a statistical example that I happened to look up. I didn't do the numbers myself. This is one survey. So in the United States, there are 744 philosophy departments. According to this study, in India, there are 148 independent philosophy departments. In China, there are 106, and in Russia, there are 40. So this will give you an example. Just in the philosophy profession itself, there is an enormous amount of departments, an enormous number of journals, people in the American Philosophical Association, and so on. So after, in my introduction, I lay out all of these arguments for America being unphilosophical, then I say, well, the rest of the book is the contrary view, my view, that it is a great philosophical culture. And I should say, as was mentioned, I was literary critic and editor of the main American newspaper for 25 years, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Had a big book section. We review about 15 books every Sunday. And so I tend to think through books. I used to have to read 3 books a week and parts of other books my whole life in that job. And so you'll see this a little bit as I go through what I tried to do. So the very first part of my book, part 1, I tried to give some journalistic sense of parts of the American philosophical landscape. So I draw a picture of the area of philosophical practitioners in the U.S. You have this here in India too. My friend Bala at the University of Delhi Philosophy Department is involved in this. These are philosophers who feel that they're just as good as psychiatrists and psychologists at helping people solve their everyday problems. And in a famous line that a major figure in America who does this, Lou Marinoff, said, he said, you don't need a medical degree in psychiatry or a PhD in psychology when you go on the metro and you notice that the guy in the corner is crazy and you should go to the other side of the car. So this is a bit controversial. Some people say, no, you should have special expertise, and common sense will not help people the way that psychiatric knowledge will. But it is one part of the American philosophy profession. In another section, introductory section, I write about African American philosophers who have largely been ignored in a lot of the standard histories and books. And when I've been complimented as by the LA Times, about the book being such a strong history as well as an argument, I think it's because I was very inclusive. I have African American philosophers. I'll talk about some of the other areas, women philosophers, Native American philosophers, and so on. So I write about the African American philosophers who often come from very humble backgrounds and who specialize in social philosophy, issues of racism, and things like that. Things that a lot of the mainstream philosophers in the U.S. have not wanted to address or talk about. And then finally, in that section, I talk about our philosophical association, which is called the American Philosophical Association. Several thousand professors, graduate students, and so on. And I tried to draw a picture of how open that association is and how possible it makes it for people to get jobs teaching philosophy. So a few years ago, I was in Frankfurt, Germany, and I was visiting the Museum die Kommunikation, the Communication Museum. I was talking to the woman who ran things there. It turned out she was a former philosophy grad student in Germany. And she had left. She didn't like it. I asked her why. She said something that was always stuck in my mind. She said, in Germany, philosophy professor is a king in his kingdom. What she meant by that was not just kind of male domination, but just the domination over one's students. If you're going to get a job, you better be in fealty to your main professor who's going to call his friend and maybe get you a job somewhere. Some of that happens in the United States, but it's really very different. The American Philosophical Association posts all the jobs. Anybody can apply. And very often somebody gets a job as a philosophy professor from strangers. they don't know anybody. They have no rabbi, as we sometimes say in the U.S. And I finished that section talking about a philosopher named Gerhard Weiner, who became a friend of mine. He's a professor at Villanova University, who I quote, just being amazed that he was able, as someone coming from Vienna, to apply for American philosophy jobs, get a bunch of interviews, and then be offered a good job at a prestigious university. So I think that's one of the pluses, actually, in our philosophy world. The next section of my book is called Parsing America. And then I try to think through a bunch of books about what does it mean to be American. Are there special characteristics? Yesterday I gave a lecture about pragmatism. Some of you were there. There's an issue internationally now as pragmatism, which has been traditionally thought of as the key American philosophy, is being picked up in a lot of other countries. And does it have to have American characteristics? Can it be separable theoretically from America? It's one of the issues people are talking about now. So as I said, I think through books. Some of the books, and I'll throw titles at you because maybe you'll be interested. Some of the books I talk about in that section, the titles is America Breaking Up, Americans, The Collision of Histories, American Exceptionalism, What It Means to Be American by Michael Walzer. Some of you may know him. He's a major political philosopher who's best known for his work on just war theory. A Machine That Would Go of Itself, The Constitution in American Life. I got very interested here in India about the differences and similarities between the American Constitution and the Indian Constitution. And Social Thought in America by Morton White, another major scholar of American philosophy. So I give a bunch of possible options there, what it means to be American, how much people retain some aspect of their former countries when they are immigrants or when they come from a long immigrant strain. We've had a lot of arguments in the U.S. about whether we should call people European American, Chinese American, Indian American, or you have to cut off that first part because now they're American. Interesting issue just in our way we use language in the U.S. The next section of my book is a kind of obeisance, a nod to the traditional canon of philosophy in America. And I call it, in a somewhat snarky way, Great White Men and the Ivy League Cavalcade. Because the traditional history of American philosophy is basically white guys with beards and mustaches, not much attention to women or anybody else. So I'm going to throw all the names at you in that section. A lot of them will be familiar to you if you're somewhat familiar with American intellectual life. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Charles Sanders Peirce, who I talked about yesterday, William James, I talked about yesterday, Santayana, I did not talk about yesterday because he's not considered a pragmatist, and some of the Spanish philosophers like Ortega y Gasset say he's not even Spanish, he's American, but that's a separate controversy. John Dewey, Willard Armand Quine, Robert Nozick, very famous political philosopher, happened to go to my high school in Brooklyn. That was a shock to me when I learned that. John Rawls, talk about John Rawls, I have a section in my book about him. Ronald Morgan, a great legal philosopher. Richard Posner, another major legal philosopher. Arthur Danto, long at Columbia University, considered our greatest philosopher of art of recent times. Stanley Cavell of Harvard, who kind of turned philosophy of film into a major subject in the philosophy departments in the U.S. And then my teacher, I was his research assistant at Princeton when he was writing a famous book called Philosophy and Mirror of Nature, Richard Rorty. So I did 2 or 3 years working for Rorty. In fact, in December, I'm supposed to go to Argentina at a major Richard Rorty conference to talk about what it was to work with him. I see Rorty as a revolutionary figure in American philosophy. He was very anti-artificial epistemology. He thought that that should just be dropped. He revived pragmatism for most people as a living philosophy. And in the traditional battle between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, he He was a singular figure because he always told students like me and others, read both and decide for yourself. So when I was a student at Princeton, most of the professors saw Kripke, Donald Davidson, and so on. They took the view that the only thing you really need to read is what we've been writing the last 10 years. You know, kind of arrogant, even though I like Donald Davidson, I like Saul Kripke, and so on. But Gordon would say, no, you know, you got to read Heidegger before you mock him. You have to read Foucault and decide whether he's important. You have to read Derrida and others, Hegel, Marx, and so on. So there's a long chapter in my book, Marty's Revolution. I then have a next section which I call Abandoning Toothless Truth, Other White Males Muscle In, where I began to push this thesis that you don't have to be a philosophy professor to be doing philosophy. And there, I can't go into all the books I talk about, but one of the points I try to make is that in American cultural criticism, there had been in the last 30 or 40 years a kind of breaking down of this traditional notion of highbrow, middle brow, and low brow. One of the key figures was a woman who was a friend of mine, very famous American cultural critic, named Susan Sontag, who managed to convince people that we needed to attend to popular culture too. And so, you know, today you see a lot of people writing serious articles about K-pop and about singers and movies and all of that. It's partly because of the breakdown of this idea that you only write serious philosophy or criticism about highbrow culture. And I argue that something similar should happen in philosophy. In other words, we should decide what's worth attending to, not because of official academic criteria, but whether we think there's important stuff to be attended to there. And in that section, I also talk about the concept of common sense, which I find really interesting about philosophy. So then I move on to other academics first, who I consider philosophical. I have a section on psychologists and psychiatrists. There, I'm using examples. When I went on tour for the book, many people would ask a question in the Q&A session, like, well, why isn't X in your book? Why isn't so-and-so in your book? Why do you, well, 672 pages, you can write a 1,500-page book. Right? So there are people who would just as easily be in my book, but I was choosing examples. So with psychologists and psychiatrists, B.F. Skinner, famous for behaviorism, Abraham Maslow, who's considered the forerunner of something which is very big around the world now called positive psychology. The idea that psychologists should not attend just to pathology, but should also try to make healthy and happy people even healthier and even happier. This is a very significant movement in positive psychology. And when I was in Sri Lanka, I gave a lecture at the University of Kelaniya, where I'm happy to see some monks here. My audience was all monks, Buddhist monks, and I gave a talk on Buddhism and positive psychology, the comparisons and the differences. I then move on to a section of literary critics. Kenneth Burke, a man who never graduated college, but became a very significant literary theorist. Irving Howe, a very major literary critic and theorist. Harold Bloom of Yale, another major philosopher of literature. And somebody who I found in India is better known, Edward Said, who also was a friend of mine, taught at Columbia a long time, is usually seen as one of the founders of Orientalism and post-colonialist work. Another section, political theorists, Francis Fukuyama, most famous, inappropriately because people think he claimed in a major book that in 1989 history ended when communism was defeated and so on. Obviously things did not turn out that way. Francis also didn't actually claim that in his book, but sort of simple-minded media coverage. Dennis Thompson, a very, very profound thinker at Harvard about ethics and politics. George Fletcher, probably our greatest philosopher since Josiah Royce, about the concept of loyalty. And again, somebody who's probably more famous here, Noam Chomsky, very famous for his work in linguistics, Also a very well-known political theorist, very far left in the way we define things in the American spectrum, so he almost never gets on the media, but has great influence, particularly on people in the left, still with us in his 90s. Then I began to push the envelope even further about who's a philosopher. I talk about George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, Robert Kaplan and Oliver Sacks, linguist, mathematician, neurologist. All, in my view, have done philosophical work. Robert Kaplan is someone who wrote a great book about the concept of zero, actually very interesting in regard to the history of Indian mathematics, because that concept is very significant in the history of Indian mathematics. Oliver Sacks, who became a very popular writer, wrote a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And George Lakoff and Mark Johnson are people who decided to write about the way in which philosophy can be embedded in people, wired into people, in a book called Philosophy in the Flesh. My most controversial chapter of this part, where I'm talking about non-philosophy professors who are philosophers, I call the casual wise man. So I had a section on gurus. I know the word guru has a kind of dual meaning in India. It can be honorific and be respectful. It can also be derogatory. I was in a bookstore in Delhi, and the owner saw me looking at all the philosophy books and came over and said, "You should read Osho." I didn't know who Osho was at that point. He said, "Come with me." I thought he was going to take me over to a book by Osho. He actually took me over to an entire section of Osho. I guess he's written, a lot of books. But after saying that, he said, "He's kind of a guru," he said to me. And I wasn't sure if he was saying that honorifically or negatively. Ever since I've asked people in philosophy departments, "Do you teach Osho?" I've gotten different answers. Some places I've lectured, they say, "Yeah, we do." And other places, no, we wouldn't. Anyway, that's a section on gurus. Then there were these people who were kind of journalistic, but also, in my view, had produced philosophy. A man named Paul Fussell, a great scholar of British literature, who then became a writer about class in the United States. People have often said the United States is really unique and also ridiculous because they claim they have no class system, but of course they do. Anyway, Fussell wrote a wonderful book kind of detailing aspects of class. My most controversial person in that section was someone named Hugh Hefner. Anybody know who Hugh Hefner was? Now, Hugh Hefner was the founder of Playboy magazine. And of course, he was an icon, both pro and con for feminists. Feminists who were kind of pro-sex, pro-liberation, and so on, they actually liked Hefner because he was a real civil libertarian, famous for bringing black jazz musicians onto TV. He was also the editorialist of the magazine, so he wrote hundreds of short essays, which he then combined in a book called The Playboy Philosophy. Now, even my friend, you may have heard of this fellow, famous Italian philosopher Umberto Eco, who is quoted on my book, said to me, "Carlino, you are going to have problems putting Hugh Hefner in your book." And I said, "I want to have problems. I'm trying to push the envelope and see why people think someone is a philosopher or not a philosopher." So anyway, he's in there. Finally, I talk about print journalists. A man named Max Lerner wrote a book called America as a Civilization, even longer than my book. I.F. Stone wrote a book called The Trial of Socrates, and he also was kind of negative on Socrates as against the tradition of philosophy where Socrates is the great hero. And Christopher Hitchens, a British thinker, journalist, who became an American citizen, very controversial as a member of the New Atheists, wrote a book extremely controversial called God is Not Great, and very nasty toward anybody religious, one of the things I criticized him for. But a very clever thinker and somebody who wrote substantial work. I'll share a couple of anecdotes I mentioned yesterday also. Once he was in a situation like this, talking to a wide group, question and answer period, and one person, in the kind of aggressive way that people are in the United States, said, "Hitchens, you are so arrogant, you are so narcissistic, it makes me sick. Is there anything wrong with your book, God is Not Great?" He was very clever, and he immediately said, "The title is one word too long. God is not, it could have been," right? So, he was a clever guy, and he shared with me, I like doing things like that. He was the first one to tell me the Oscar Wilde anecdote, where Oscar Wilde was once asking everybody in the room, I'll speak on anything, any subject, and somebody said, the Queen. He said, Queen is not a subject. So there's something to be said for a good wit, I would say. But all four of these people in that section I consider to be philosophers. Finally, I talked about some broadcasters, a man named Bill Moyers, who died, unfortunately, earlier this year, who had a show on TV for years called A World of Ideas, where he would invite on very significant thinkers, highbrow thinkers, philosophers, and so on. I remember him telling me he tried to get Rawls, but Rawls didn't like to do these public things. And Joseph Campbell, who was one of our greatest scholars of religion and mythology. The next part of my book is called, you're beginning to see why it's a 672-page book. The next part of my book is called The Rising Outsiders. So I have a long section on African Americans. We have a wonderful tradition of African American philosophy going back to the 19th century, Frederick Douglass, David Walker, coming up to the present, people like Cornel West. And often they have been ignored in histories of philosophy, but I thought they shouldn't be. I have a 100-page section on women in philosophy, going back to Hypatia, who you may know was torn to pieces way back. One reviewer of my book, not a woman, wrote, Mr. Romano has a disproportionately long section on women philosophers. No woman wrote that, I might note in a review. But, we are, again, I don't know really what the situation is in India. I've been delighted to see how many women are studying philosophy in India as I've gone around lecturing. But are they being included in syllabi? Are courses being taught on them alone and so on? Well, we've seen a lot of progress in the United States on that. A major woman philosopher would say, United States, like Martha Nussbaum, if you've heard of her, who was the partner of Amartya Sen for a number of years, became very interested in women in India and so on. There are courses now on Nussbaum in the U.S. She's right up there with Aquinas or Gordon and so on. So that's good. I have a rather short section on Native American philosophers. It used to be called Indian philosophers, Native American philosophers. And also, reviewers can be very nasty when they review a book. One person wrote, Romano has a very scanty section on Native American philosophers. To which my answer was, compared to who? Because I couldn't find any other book that actually had a section on Native American philosophers. So at least I gave them some space. And these are traditional, Native American thinkers. A very famous one was the Black Elk. They often spoke in epigrams, in aphorisms, and so on. But so have many philosophers in the West. And then I have a section on gay philosophers. And why? Because I thought, their gayness has often been taken out, truncated out of who they were. I'm not gay myself. It wasn't some kind of loyalist act. But, I thought of Wittgenstein, who was gay. I thought of Foucault, who I knew personally, who was quite gay and quite, a cruiser. And these things actually had an impact on their thought. I knew that. So I thought that should get some attention in the history of philosophy. Next section I call Gutenberg's Revenge, the Explosion of Cyber Philosophy. Today I might, if I were publishing the book, need to change it to Gutenberg's Revenge, the Explosion of AI Philosophy. What I was noticing as a book editor, and at one point in my job at my newspaper, I was getting 800 books for free in the mail every week for review, out of which we will review about 15, and then the rest sent to prisons and hospitals and libraries and all that. And I was struck how even in the digital age, people just kept knocking out books about the effect of the digital age on different areas. And I started to teach a class on cyber philosophy. What was the effect of the digital revolution on religion, on romance, on law, on the military, so on. So in that section, which begins "The book lives!" exclamation mark, I talk about cyber politics, cyber religion, cyber literature, and then the last section, which I think I could write today about AI, I call cyber cynics. These were the serious thinkers who were saying, oh, everybody's pushing, cyber and digital, everybody's pushing AI today. This is just a business thing. People are trying to sell you AI, trying to sell companies AI. Nothing's really going to change. It's just a new mechanical system. All the basic, important philosophical things will remain the same. So those are the cyber cynics. The next section addresses Socrates. And how many of you have ever heard of Socrates? That's Socrates with an I in front of the S. Anybody? I see a couple of nods. Most people, usually when I would ask this in the U.S., lots of hands would go up and say, no, not Socrates. Socrates, and the hands go down. Right? So Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher who was a little younger than Socrates. He was a little older than Plato. He starved himself to death at the age of 97 when the Persians won some battle against the Greeks. He considered himself a philosopher. At that point in ancient Greece, the word philosopher and the word philosophy were in play. They were not tied down. They were not tied to presentation of evidence or persuasiveness or whatever. But Socrates was somebody who wrote speeches, but he also wrote essays and so on. And the reason I want him as a kind of father figure for American philosophy and pragmatism, I sometimes think of him as the Richard Carney of ancient Greece, is that he was against certainty. He did not believe in certainty. He believed that truths had to be understood in their particular societies and times. He believed that credible belief, warranted assertions, in Dewey's phrase, depended on the back and forth of argument in the society and what consensus was finally reached. So, unlike Socrates, who thought, and again, when we speak of Socrates, I'm sure many of you know, the Socrates we usually teach in philosophy departments is a product of Plato. Right? Socrates didn't write anything. There's also an ancient Greek figure named Xenophon, who also wrote about Socrates, and his Socrates looks a lot different than Plato's Socrates. So we always have to be a little careful when we attribute beliefs to Socrates rather than Plato's Socrates. But Plato's Socrates did believe in the dialectic that led you to kind of certain understandings of ideas that are floating in the air, the idea of a chair, the idea of love, and so on. And Socrates did not believe in that. So I call that chapter Socrates, a man, not a typo, because, again, people often confuse it with Socrates. But he's been kind of written out of the tradition by Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle was very condescending toward him, so was Plato, although there's a couple of dialogues in which he's more respectful. And I make the argument there that Socrates is someone who, in fact, was read and thought about by our founding fathers in the U.S., who were very well educated in Greek philosophy. And so my final part of that section is Socrates, Greece, and America. The next section, complete move in another direction. We call it Just Saying No to Justification, the Magnificent Failure of John Rawls. So, Rawls was someone I interviewed just about every major philosopher of my era, and before I tried to interview John Rawls, who had a slight speaking defect, and he did not like doing interviews, and he was a very modest man, and actually he said to me, in a phrase that has stuck in my mind, when you consider that he's considered the great political philosopher for the last 50 years. He said to me, "I'm sorry, Carlin, but I wouldn't want to draw attention to myself." Talk about modesty. In any case, as we grew up, people my age reading Rawls' Theory of Justice, we sort of thought, okay, a magnificent analytic philosopher who decided to pick justice off the shelf, and that was going to be his subject. When I wrote the first draft of my book, my editor, a very great editor in American publishing, said to me, "You know, your Rawls chapter is not harmonious with the rest of your book." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You have all this rich biography and detail, but when you come to Rawls, you're really writing as a professional philosopher and academic. You're just analyzing these concepts, the veil of ignorance, the difference principle aspects of his work. You need actually to figure out who was John Rawls, just the way you talked about who was Charles Peirce, who was John Dewey." So I did that as a journalist and so on, and it was an amazing discovery. So it turns out that John Rawls was an extremely lucky person. When he was a child, he contracted an illness which he passed on to his brothers. Two of his brothers died. John Rawls survived. Later on, at the time of the end of World War II, John Rawls was in the American Army. He was in the Philippines, and then he was in Japan. In the Philippines, at one point, he's with his buddy, and a commanding officer came over and said, "Look, we need somebody to give blood. You two guys, what are your blood types?" So the guy with John Rawls, his pal, had the right blood type. The commanding officer said, "You come with me. You're okay, Rawls." Those two people were killed that day by the Japanese. So it turned out that John Rawls really had encounters with injustice and the unfairness of life and the uncertainty of life. And it turns out that's what actually drove him to the subject, I discovered. Now, a funny thing that happened with Rawls, and I'm coming to the end of this long tour through my book, funny thing that happened with Rawls is that despite the enormous prestige of the theory of justice, particularly in the United States and England and English-speaking world, bit by bit, the secondary scholarship kept saying, but this isn't true of an Islamic society. This isn't true of this culture, that culture, the next culture. Really, it's only true of Western liberal democracy. You know, your conception of justice does not fit the cognate words for justice in many other languages. And later in his career, Rawls acknowledged this. He said, "You're right. It doesn't. What I've articulated is really a kind of ideal form of justice for a liberal democratic society." So the last part of my section there is called "The Theory is Not Successful," because even some of Rawls's top acolytes, people who have devoted their lives to his work, one of them, a teacher of mine, Thomas Hogan, who's been at Yale and Columbia, they were saying this themselves, like, the theory doesn't work for this society, that society, so on. I end my book with an epilogue, which I call Obama, Philosopher in Chief. And why? Well, in part, because Obama was president when I published this book. This book came out in 2012. And I'm happy to say it's still getting attention, but again, we've had other presidents since. And I was trying to make the point that we have often had in American history philosophical presidents. We certainly do not at the moment. But we had Jefferson. We had Lincoln. Some people would include Woodrow Wilson. And having learned the lesson that my editor taught me that I needed to be biographical as well as philosophical in this book, I began to look very seriously into Obama's history. And it turns out he was very genuinely philosophical. When he was a student at Occidental College in California, when he was at Harvard Law School and became the editor of the Harvard Law Review. One of the real eye-opening aspects to me was in my globe-trotting job as critic at large in the Chronicle of Higher Education. At one point, I spent 10 days in Brazil. And in Brazil, I was there to write about someone you may have heard about. He's a well-known international philosopher named Roberto Mangabeira Unger, U-N-G-A-R. And he had been chosen by Lula, current president of Brazil, president back then too, to be the minister of the future in Brazil. So he had been Obama's teacher. And he told me that when Obama was at Harvard, like Obama would come to his office all the time. He wants to talk about Reinhold Niebuhr, he wants to talk about Kant, he wants to talk about John Stuart Mill. When he ran for president, being a smart politician, of course, he dumbed that down somewhat and wasn't constantly quoting philosophers. But I saw Obama as a real, genuine philosophical intellectual. And I think he's lived up to that in his post-presidency. So I kind of bring the book to a close, with this idea that, if we were in fact able to elect someone like Obama president, it lends some credence to my theory that we are a philosophical culture. We can recognize philosophical quality even in a politician, and one would hope for more of the same. We have not had more of the same recently, but we can still hope for the future. So that's the overview of the book. The part of these lectures that I've given in India that I like most is the one that comes now, when you guys ask questions and we have a nice discussion. So thanks for listening. And I sometimes find audiences in India, as in China, where I've taught a lot, a little too passive. So don't be passive. Insult me if you like, offend me if you like, contradict me if you like. We enjoy that. That's a good thing. So, anybody? Yeah. Matt? Yeah, microphone.
Thank you, sir. I have very basic questions. Just two questions. First of all, you have read some of the Indian philosophers and thinkers, as you mentioned some of the names, including Osho as well. So while writing this book, what inspiration you took from Indian philosophers, especially Indian philosophy, and how you integrated them into your book by writing this America the Philosophy? The second thing is, I might have missed it. Maybe you would have said something about it in the initial part, though I was busy somewhere else. So I would like to know that during writing this book, America the Philosophical, who were your targeted audiences and why? Like, as you started with a sentence that it is not necessary to be an academic philosopher in order to write a book on philosophy. So, is this book target layman or an academic philosopher? These are my two very basic though important questions so that one can find it interesting and an inspiration. Why should one read this book? Thank you.
No, thank you for those questions. So I'll start with, with your second one. It was always intended, it took me 10 years to write this book. It was always intended for a mass audience. My publisher, Alfred A. Knopf, is usually considered one of the two most prestigious trade publishers in the U.S. Everything they publish is sent out to the whole country, to the whole world, foreign rights and so on. So it was very clear from the beginning that I was supposed to write a book that was accessible. Because of my career as a journalist, they thought I could write a book that was accessible. I was kind of known for having an accessible style and so on. So my hope was that, it would be something read by educated people of all sorts, even people of minimal education who felt they could work their way through it. I mean, I've had a lot of people say to me over the years that I learned so many new words reading your book. So I guess I do have, I suppose, a sophisticated vocabulary, but I also try to be funny. There are word plays in the book, there are funny stories and all of that, and to make it more appealing. Probably the best thing that ever happened to me in my career was that this book was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, which is the single most important place you can get attention for a book. So I owe a lot of my subsequent career to that. The Chinese who were inviting me all over the place, and I've gotten a lot of foreign invitations. I think my Fulbright is somewhat related to the success of the book and so on. I didn't expect to be asked for pictures and to have to pay $10,000 for rights and things, but that's the way it goes. In regard to Indian philosophy, the book is not comparative. Actually, the most comparative section of the book is that first part where I talk about why America might not be philosophical. So there I mention a lot of countries where philosophers are more important. Hungary, where Thomas Masaryk was the founder sort of the country, philosophy professor. Here, of course, Ramakrishnan and others. France, philosophers are much more prominent in public life. People become ministers. My friend Luc Ferry became Minister of Culture at one time. So, by a lot of criteria, you could argue that philosophy is not very significant in the U.S. So I didn't really go into comparisons with India very much. Later, it's interesting, I wrote an encyclopedia article whose title was originally Asian Philosophy of Religion. And in the way encyclopedias work, at a certain point, the editor-in-chief, and Indian philosophy was going to be a part of that. The editor-in-chief said, that's too much for one article. Let's just make yours East Asian philosophy of religion. And we're going to assign a separate Indian philosophy of religion, as well as Hinduism, Jainism, and many other articles. So I had to cut out my program of trying to really learn a lot more about Indian philosophy. And so that article that's published is Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. But one of the reasons I wanted to come here is because I've always also been fascinated by Indian culture, Indian literature, Indian film, and so on. And my project is actually looking for what I call pragmatist elements across Indian culture. So with some attention to Ambedkar, of course, who was a student of Dewey, but not just Ambedkar, other ways in which I see pragmatist thinking playing out in ordinary Indian life. And any of you have any thoughts on this, please send me an email. I usually ask them to project, and maybe you're doing this, right? You're projecting things. Can you project my email just in case or whoever's doing this can maybe project my card, my email, but it's so helpful to me to hear from people, particularly in audiences where I've spoken. What do you think about Indian philosophy, studying Indian philosophy here? Are there pragmatist elements? When you look at the culture, your politics as a whole, do you see pragmatist thinking in a high pragmatist mode? Anyway, I appreciate that. But that's sort of my situation with Indian. And, I've known Indian philosophers like Akil Goswami at Columbia, March's Sen, I've written about, I met him, and so on. The Argumentative Indian, he has that wonderful book. But I would in no way put myself forward as an expert on Indian philosophy. I'm learning, and happily learning. Somebody can give you a mic so people can hear you in the back. Is there a mic over there? By the way, I want to tell you a little anecdote about being heard in situations like this. Susan Sontag, the cultural critic I mentioned, was the only person I ever knew who had the courage and the nerve to do this in a public meeting. She was sitting like some of you people in the back or so on, couldn't quite hear, at a big meeting, and she yelled out to the speaker, who's a very prestigious person, Susan Contact, "Speak into the mic, that's why it's there." Okay, so I've seen other people do that. That wasn't rare. The rare thing was that, as often happened with speakers, that speaker after a couple of minutes wandered away from the mic.
Yep.
Susan said, no, the idea is that once you speak into the mic, you should continue to speak into the mic. And I thought, God, she really has it. She's not afraid of anything. Okay, end of anecdote. Go ahead, sir.
I think the mic is not working, so you can come and.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we want to use this.
Really, thank you so much, sir, for the really thought-provoking talk. And I found some worries about whether American pragmatists are they able to supplement some philosophical arguments in this artificial, you can say, artificial debate for their intellectual interviewers. What sort of methods they are trying to do, they're trying to imply. Because the era is very much favor of artificial intelligence, they are favor of, they are doing artificial debate. So that it's very difficult for me, it is very difficult to implement our philosophical arguments in our intellectual endeavors. So what is the suggestion of American pragmatists?
So now we're going back, to the subject of yesterday's talk. And as I tried to explain yesterday, I spent a lot of time talking about the three classical major American pragmatists, Charles Sanders first, William James, and John Dewey. So they didn't agree on everything. But one thing they did agree on was what is most associated with Dewey was pragmatism as a method of inquiry, as a method rather than a series of absolute beliefs. So one of the things I was pointing out is that pragmatism, and this was in regard to Buddhism, we were talking about, nirvana, enlightenment, becoming an arhat, on the side of Buddhism. And what about pragmatism? Well, pragmatism doesn't put forth any absolute aim. It can be open to a lot of final aims. And it didn't share some of the assumptions of Buddhism. In other words, it doesn't think desire is bad. It's not in favor of withdrawal from the world in any regard. Dewey's idea was that our lives are lives where we constantly find problems. We are organisms in a world that confront problems, right? And what should we do when we confront a problem? Dewey's idea was that inquiry just continues all the time, and you should be extremely open to all information, all context, and so on, as you then make a judgment about what the solution to your problem will be. And the pragmatists all agree that as soon as you solve this problem, you've got another one over here. That's life, right? So there has been a long-standing view that pragmatism is very in line with what some people call common sense. Because I think most of all of us, this is the way we actually deal with life when we leave the seminar room. We have a problem, how we're going to solve it, let's get as much information as we can, and then make a judgment what's more important, this, that, the thing in the middle, and so on. First, when you go to epistemology, Peirce believed very much that the consequences, the practical consequences of any concept were the whole meaning of that concept. He began by talking about hardness in regard to glass and being able to scratch glass, but he felt that way in regard to even what we might call mushier concepts, justice, love, compassion, things like that. Some people would describe pragmatism then as instrumentalist. That was often the word used about Dewey. Others consequentialist, but it's not consequentialist in the sense of utilitarianism which is consequential, but has a very key ending, right? The greatest happiness and the greatest number. So pragmatism doesn't assume that should be the end goal. So again, there are differences. James, as I said yesterday, was famously open to Buddhism. He was in fact probably the chief proponent of paying attention to Buddhism in the late 19th century. He wrote to Vivekananda, criticizing Vivekananda for criticizing Buddhism. He set up a whole series of lectures, which began with lectures on Buddhism. So James of the Pragmatists was the most open-minded. He invested in you could talk to the dead. You know, he went to seances. So he's kind of in his corner compared to Dewey and Peirce, who were not as open to anything that was not scientific, rational, or what we call in philosophy often naturalism, which is the idea that the only world there is the world that science has shown us. All mythologies are false. God is false. Gods are false multiple times. I mean, that's naturalism. Yeah, and James famously cared most about the psychological states of people. So he famously wrote, God exists because God is in the minds of people. So he wasn't saying there was actually an entity out there, but he said we have to take this concept seriously. Sure, you're welcome. You want to come? You want to use the mic too? It's free. I'm not going to charge anybody to take my mic. 50 rupees, 75 rupees.
No, thank you for giving this opportunity. And you have mentioned about in your lecture, you have mentioned about isocrate, and you have questioned does anyone know about isocrate? So what does it influence in your book? My question America by saying Romano means by saying America is influenced by isocrate or rather than idiotic America.
Well, so here is how unknown Isocrates is. As I told you, I needed to find pictures from my book. So I want one of my editors saying, so we need a picture of Isocrates. So I'm trying desperately to find a bust, an ancient bust. I went to your museum here today with all these fantastic things from the whole history of India. I was going to museums of that sort. I went to Plaka. Plaka is the tourist area of Athens in Greece. If you've ever been there, you know that they sell hundreds of figurines of Greek writers, Aeschylus, Euripides, Demosthenes, all these people. So I'm trying to look for one of Isocrates, and nobody had ever seen a figure of Isocrates. And one guy said to me, Isocrate, my cousin is named Isocrate. Could you use a picture of my cousin? I said, well, actually, no, it has to be the famous guy from Lombardy. But it was amazing. In Greece, finally, in part of my career, that was when I was writing the book, I was the Russian correspondent of my newspaper, living in St. Petersburg, Russia. As I continued to be the literary editor, I was a little crazy doing both jobs. And it turned out that the Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow, they had the only figurine of Isocrates. So that's a little bit of a separate, riff. But when my book was reviewed in the New York Times, basically in a positive way, the only negative thing the reviewer said was that he's crazy about Isocrates. I've read Isocrates, and he's not even worth, Socrates' foot or toe or something. But in fact, he read this really stupid piece by Isocrates that had nothing to do with these larger philosophical ideas. So I didn't accept that criticism. But I would happily say that now you've all heard of Isocrates. There are 3 volumes of his work in the Harvard Loeb Library. He is readable. And he's not the world's greatest stylist, I would say, and the Socratic dialogues are more lively, certainly better for teaching and all of that. But if you come down to like, who has a truer view of the world and how we decide the meaning of concepts, I would say Socrates. And one of his major concepts, by the way, was that, does anybody here do ancient Greek philosophy? Working on that a little bit? Yeah. There's a concept that's very key for...
the method of methodologic food and political philosophy.
Yeah, well, so in my section on Socrates, who has often been called a sophist, said, I'm not a sophist. He's often been called a rhetorician. I'm not a rhetorician. I'm a philosopher. So that's part of the debate. So one of the things that he emphasized was something called kairos, K-A-I-R-O-S. And kairos was the idea that the highest intellectual faculty you could have is to know what to do or what to say in a particular moment, in exactly the right moment, to survive or to achieve what you want to achieve, and so on. And so kairos fit very much with his general philosophy, which is that there are no absolute answers for any situation or any era or whatever. You've got to have this ability to syncretize lots of information and then decide what to do or what to say. And he very famously, in one case when he was in front of a tyrant and was asked to speak, he very cleverly refused to speak because he thought he might get his head cut off, which is why he lived to 97. Anybody else? Yeah. So people won't be able to hear you. Susan Sontag, who's now gone, she's looking down at me saying, good, Carl, let people talk into the mic.
So, Professor, it's not a question, it's kind of curiosity that I want to know about this
Picture?
yes. And what is the significance of this picture, and why you put specifically 13 stars on it?
Yeah, no, good question. I can see she's a design person. She's doing these things and all that. So it's interesting. So this is the paperback edition of the book. There was a hardcover edition of the book. And the hardcover edition of the book had this inscrutable symbol on it. And I remember my editor, who was, what shall I say, not tremendously respectful of me at times. When I first saw the cover of the book, I said, what is that symbol? It's meaningless. And he said, Carlin, you don't know anything about publishing. Shut up. This is going to mystify people, and then they'll come to your book, and then they'll figure out what it is. I said, no. I'm the literary editor of a newspaper. I know something about publishing. This is just a stupid symbol that's not going to tell anybody what the book is. Well, any of you who have published a book probably know publishers are very powerful. They can change your title. They can protect your book. They can tell you, change this or change that. So on the hardcover version, that symbol went through. And I remember having lunch with the guy I mentioned, the broadcaster, Bill Moyers, after it came out and saying, so Bill, what do you think of this? He said, it's meaningless. So that was my word for it, So when it came to the paperback, I'm dealing with a different division of the publisher. And I had learned enough to say, gee, I'd like to be involved. So could we come up with something that projected Greece because of the Isocrates and America and so on? So this is, my memory is this, the actual bust is one from Aristotle. It's one of the busts of Aristotle. The stars, 13 original stars of the American flag. Red, white, and blue. I didn't want my book to be red, white, and blue. I lost that battle. Publisher said, it's red, white, and blue. I said, why? He said, because all the crazy patriots on the right wing of America will buy your book simply because it's red, white, and blue. I said, well, that's persuasive. I don't mind that. So that's how it came about. And I was lucky that the design people with the paperback were very open to my participation because they could very easily have said, none of your business, go home, do your job, we'll do our job. Yeah, that's how it happened.
I have just one.
Sure.
Suppose I ask you, what is the philosophy of American people?
Can you hear him back there?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So what is the philosophy of American people? Whether it is pragmatism or naturalism or Catholic Christian philosophy?
So suppose what's the philosophy of the Indian people? No, I mean you would say, oh, you can't generalize that.
They are leaning towards pragmatism. So I would like to know what is the philosophy of most of the American people?
Okay, well, that's right. So the first thing I would say is, we are tremendously diverse, as you are tremendously diverse here. We do a terrible job of covering India in the American media, and for us, India is Modi, India, and that's it. There's nothing about all the fighting between the states and the center. I mean, Tamil Nadu doesn't want Hindi. Stalin's yelling at Modi. Modi hates the chief minister of West Bengal. All of this stuff. We never cover any of that stuff, right? Only if there's a disaster and Shimla is closed off by landslides or things like that. So I don't think I could generalize, to a philosophy because we are so diverse, and Latino Americans, African Americans. If you're following the news in the U.S., we're very polarized right now, right-wingers versus left-wingers, after the assassination of that fellow Charlie Kirk. But I would say there are some unifying elements, one of which I mentioned at the beginning, which is that Americans are, I think, very, very powerful in their belief that they are equal and can be equal when it comes to expressing what they think. Even the humblest person, the street cleaner, the bus driver, whatever, feels he or she has a right to say what they think. Let me give you an example, and also we're not obviously a perfectly egalitarian society, either are you, as you know. We have our wealthy, we have our poor, and so on. But there's an actual resistance in America to the wealthy and the powerful imposing themselves in very unequal ways. So I'll just tell you, as you can probably tell, I tell a lot of anecdotes and a lot of stories. So when I was in Russia as a foreign correspondent, I was once on a long line for the cinema with my Russian girlfriend. And a black limousine pulled up, Brazil, and this tall, gorgeous, blonde woman with this short, ugly, bald man came out. And they cut the line, as we say, right? They didn't go to the back line, they just kind of pushed in front and went in. And I said to my friend, this would never happen in the United States. The people in front, they would not say, go to the back, who do you think you are? Go to the back of the line. And she said to me, the Assistant Minister of Finance. The little guy. But even if it was the Assistant Minister of Finance in the U.S., it wouldn't happen. And that to me is an example of this kind of an egalitarian feeling where, some years ago, somebody during the State of the Union address just yelled out, "You're a liar!" And the President, there is this egalitarianism, which I would say is a shared view. And this belief in freedom of expression. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens in the next month in the U.S. because Trump is going crazy. Trump is trying to cancel talk show hosts. He's saying he's going to put people in jail. He just said that yesterday Trump said, anyone who criticizes him should go to jail. It's illegal to criticize him. Completely nuts. Now, we know as Americans, he is nuts. He is slowly losing his mind. Many of us believe. But will he be able to push this through? Because you've got a lot of people under him who are not losing their minds, but are very committed to his agenda. So we're hoping our judicial system pushes back and Democrats push back, particularly given our First Amendment, because everything he's doing in regard to freedom of speech is exactly what the First Amendment was meant to protect Americans from. First Amendment does not, I teach the course in the First Amendment from my lawyer's side at the University of Pennsylvania, so I do know this stuff. First Amendment is only about government coming down on people's freedom of expression. It does not protect you against your company, for instance, firing you. It's all about government trying to suppress free speech. So that's exactly what Trump is doing these days, and we're going to need a very strong judiciary to push back and say, you are violating the First Amendment, you can't do this, you can't do that. But, I mean, he's like breaking the law every day, so it's hard for the courts to catch up to him. Anyway, that's the best answer I can give you. I don't think there's a uniform philosophy, but you might say there's a uniform ethos that a lot of Americans share. And new people is fascinating as immigrants really take this on. They often will say, like, I couldn't say what I want in my country, but here I'm going to say what I think. And so I don't like everything about the U.S., a lot of bad things about the U.S., but I like that.
So philosophical without philosophy.
Well, I mean, it's a type of philosophy, it's a philosophical belief, And again, if you look in our tradition, legally and philosophically, as I've had to do as a scholar because I teach that course, in the 18th century, we did not have free expression of that sort. We had terrible libel laws. American freedom of expression really takes off at the beginning of the 20th century with a pragmatist named Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice, who began to write first in dissent and then in the majority, saying that freedom of speech needs to be corrected. We can't throw everybody in jail because they're against the government, and so on. So the 19th century is actually a pretty bad century for freedom of speech in the U.S. I'm happy to take more questions. I leave it to my hosts to end the session when they want to end it, but there's a question there. I feel like a game show host. Come on up.
Sir, my question is related to something you just said right now.
You are the sum of all of your thoughts.
But sir, I don't believe that I am the sum of all my thoughts. But coming to my question, I would like to ask about the synchronicity aspect of the part. Like you said that we have to perform the right action at the right time. We need to have to survive. But I have an objection to this, that to have that synchronicity, is it also dependent on the society? Because we don't control the information which is given from us from the time we are born. It is actually which is out of our control, the place we are born, the information we are brought up in. So the information is not in our control. So can the synchronicity be out of our free will, or is it survival is also part of the conditional aspect of the existence or part of the free will? So that is the question.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that everybody can have wonderful kairos. Obviously, people differ in their ability to take in information, to be open to information. I mean, I'm sometimes asked in these situations, so what is philosophy to you? Philosophy to me is argument that presents evidence for whatever was being argued for, that is somewhat sustained. It's not a 1 minute thing, it's not a 2 minute thing. It has to be open to counter criticism, has to be open to counter evidence and argument. It has to be done with, not without humor necessarily, but ultimately seriously, where you give time for people to present counter argument, counter evidence, and so on. But even if you are not perfect at kairos, your ability, for instance, to adjust to different environments can improve your ability at kairos. Let me give you an example from yesterday. So my friend here, took me down to the Ghats. I went down to the cremation place. I went through all those narrow lanes. Now, when I'm in the United States and I'm walking in a city, I'm not always paying perfect attention to every little thing going around me. But I'm also not used to motorcycles shooting by me in a narrow lane, shooting across me, suddenly having a cow in front of me, and so on. So I adjusted. I realized when I was down there that I have to be really, really attentive to the street. There are holes in the street, and I don't want to fall. I have to be attentive when I can hear a motorcycle zooming at ridiculous speed in a lane that is a two-way lane, but can barely accommodate a single motorcycle. So I adapted. My Kairos was saying, don't be looking up at the top of the building, don't be looking at all these people. Pay attention to where you're walking, or else you're going to get run over here. So I just give that as an example of how Kairos and good judgment in a particular moment requires taking account of all the information where you are just then. And I think, if you do that, your judgment definitely improves. I mean, I'm still here, and if I hadn't done that yesterday, I think I might be under a motorcycle somewhere, or being taken to the cremation spot myself.
Well, thank you, Professor Carlin, for really giving us a detailed picture of the American philosophical culture. And I noticed the important factor in his narration, that being journalist, since he has served as a journalist for long years, what interesting thing he has done, that he has gone back into each and every philosopher's life. What has made him or her a kind of philosopher, a kind of philosophy that he or she is doing, a kind of psychoanalytic exercise. So this is a kind of interesting account that he has put up for various philosophers that he has taken into account while writing his book on America philosophical. So it's been really interesting and fruitful discussion. Now this is a time to propose vote of thanks, and I would like to invite Dr. Mohi Singh.
Is this the famous summary? Given to summer? Oh my God. I don't envy you.
Thank you so much, Professor Carlin Romano. I'm not here to summarize the entire lecture. I hope you were very much clear in your opinion and thoughts, and you have taken us to the tour of your book, and I hope that everybody enjoyed over here. So simply, I'm here to propose a word of thanks. This is the tradition, so we do it. And I just want to say that Professor Carlin Romano very beautifully discussed his book, which title in itself is very fascinating, because when I first read the title, I was like, what exactly in this book? And now I'm sure that you all must have traveled from the very beginning of the philosophical canon in American society to today's time, where America is actually taking lead in many philosophical deliberations, such as socio-political philosophy, to the AI ethics, morality, etc. They are setting up various stages to have the meticulous discussion and debate over the philosophical topics. So, Professor Carlin, you have basically, I'm not going to summarize, but yes, I would definitely say that you have showed that philosophy is not a dry and abstract discipline, rather it makes us able to lead a life worth living. And I thank you from the very bottom of my heart, like from the entire departmental part, because you have not just shown what you have written, rather how it should be written. So if somebody somebody is interested to do something like in their own domain, showing that what being philosophical is, they can take inspiration from you. So thank you so much, and I thank the head of the department, Professor Yogesh Chaudhary sir, and the convener of this program, Dr. I.K. Maurya, to organize this book discussion. And I think in a very short span of time, in a short notice. So thank you all, and thank you Professor Anand Mishra sir, Professor Rakesh Haq, Dr. P.K. Babre, and Dr. Abel Behra, my colleagues, to present here. And last but not the least, thanks to all the students for your patient listening and fruitful discussion. And it was indeed a wonderful deliberation. So thank you again, and I wish that your book receives the due respect, attention, and applause. So thank you once again.
Yeah, you sit there and then do it. Yeah.
And I'm finishing my PhD here. So, well, I'm